On a January night in 1837, Catherine Brennan sat in a chair in the corner of a locked room at Sweetwater Plantation, a pen trembling in her hand and a blank ledger page before her. Her husband stood across from her, his gray eyes cold as winter steel, and gave her explicit instructions about what she was to observe and record. The woman brought into that room was named Ruth. She was 23 years old, terrified, and had no choice in what was about to happen. Neither did Catherine. What began that night would continue for years, turning a Georgia plantation into something far darker than the usual horrors of slavery. It would involve a doctor from Charleston with twisted theories about human breeding, a network of wealthy men trading children like livestock, and a secret that would eventually consume everyone it touched. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Brennan and the nightmare that unfolded at Sweetwater, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We love hearing from our community across America. What Catherine witnessed that night was only the beginning of something far more calculated and horrifying than she could have imagined. Milledgeville served as Georgia's capital from 1804 to 1868, a city of red clay roads and white columned buildings where politicians and plantation owners mingled in parlors thick with cigar smoke and schemes. 20 Mi northeast, where the Oconee River carved through pine forests and bottomland. Sweetwater Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of cotton fields. The main house, built in the Federal style, with its symmetrical facade and tall windows, stood on a slight rise positioned so that Nathaniel Brennan could survey his entire domain from the second-floor gallery. Nathaniel had inherited Sweetwater from his father in 1832 at age 28, along with 37 enslaved people, and a reputation for cold efficiency. He stood just under 6 feet, lean and angular, with pale gray eyes that people said looked through you rather than at you. His hands were always clean, nails trimmed short, a stark contrast to the dirt-creased fingers of other planters who still worked alongside their field hands in those early years. Nathaniel never touched a plow. He studied ledgers, read agricultural journals from Charleston and Savannah, and corresponded with men who spoke of scientific farming and rational management of resources, both plant and human. Catherine Haywood became Catherine Brennan in May 1834. She was 19, he was 30, and the marriage united two prominent Middle Georgia families. Her father owned a successful mercantile business in Milledgeville, supplying everything from fabric to farm equipment to the surrounding plantations. Catherine had been educated at a finishing school in Augusta, unusual for the time, and could read Latin, play pianoforte, and manage household accounts with precision. She had auburn hair that she wore in the fashionable style of the era, pulled back severely from a face that portraits show was handsome rather than beautiful, with a strong jaw and intelligent dark eyes. Their first year passed pleasantly, enough by the standards of planter society. Catherine managed the household, servants, organized dinners for Bahi.my.n. Nathaniel's political connections, and learned the rhythms of plantation life. The house smelled of beeswax and lavender in summer, woods and cinnamon in winter. She kept a garden of medicinal herbs, as most plantation mistresses did, learning which plants soothed fever and which eased the pains of childbirth for the enslaved women who had no access to proper doctors. But by their second anniversary, the absence of Children had become a source of tension. In a society that measured a woman's worth by her ability to produce heirs, Catherine's failure to conceive was whispered about at church socials and ladies' teas. Nathaniel said nothing directly, but Catherine noticed the way his jaw tightened when friends mentioned their growing families, the way he would leave the room. When someone asked when they might hear the patter of little feet at Sweetwater. In September 1836, Nathaniel brought a doctor from Augusta to examine Catherine. The man spent 3 days at the plantation conducting examinations that Catherine later described in her diary as humiliating beyond measure. His conclusion delivered to Nathaniel in the study while Catherine waited in the parlor was definitive. Some defect in her womb made conception impossible. The doctor used technical terms Catherine did not understand, but the message was clear. She would never bear children. Nathaniel's response was not anger, which Catherine might have expected. Instead, he became eerily calm. He thanked the doctor, paid him generously, and sent him back to Augusta. That night, at dinner, he told Catherine that he had been doing a great deal of reading. He had corresponded with men in Charleston who were studying what they called natural philosophy, the science of heredity and breeding. If Catherine could not give him an heir through natural means, he would pursue alternative methods that were, he assured her, perfectly legal under Georgia law, and widely practiced, if not widely discussed, throughout the South. Catherine understood immediately what he meant. The practice was indeed common, though rarely acknowledged openly. Planters who wanted to increase their labor force without the expense of purchasing more slaves would father children through enslaved women. These children, inheriting their mother's status regardless of their father's race, would themselves become property. Some planters kept these arrangements discreet. Others were blatant about it. But what Nathaniel proposed went far beyond the usual exploitation. He wanted her involved. He wanted her present. He wanted her to document everything. The first woman Nathaniel selected was named Ruth, 23 years old, tall and strong from years of fieldwork. On a cold January night in 1837, Nathaniel had Ruth brought to a room on the east side of the main house, a room that had once been used for storing linens, but which he had converted for this purpose. He ordered Catherine to be present, to observe, to take notes on Ruth's physical characteristics, her health, her demeanor. Catherine's diary entry from that night was brief, the handwriting shaky. God, forgive me, I did as he commanded. I sat in the corner with pen and paper while my husband destroyed what remained of my dignity and Ruth's humanity. She did not cry out. I think that was the worst part, the silence. But Nathaniel's plan was even more elaborate than Catherine initially realized. Over the following weeks, she discovered that he had been reading extensively about the theories of selective breeding being discussed in agricultural journals and medical societies. These theories, which would later be recognized as the pseudo-scientific racism that underpinned slavery's most horrific aspects, suggested that human beings could be improved through careful selection of breeding pairs, just as one might breed horses or cattle for desirable traits. Nathaniel had decided to conduct an experiment. Spring of 1837 brought unseasonable warmth to Baldwin County. The dogwoods bloomed early, filling the woods around Sweetwater with white blossoms that fell like snow in the slightest breeze. Catherine walked among them one morning in late March, crushing petals beneath her boots, trying to find some fragment of peace in the natural world, because there was none to be found within the walls of her home. Ruth was pregnant. Catherine had confirmed it herself, recognizing the sign she had once hoped to see in her own body. Nathaniel received the news with satisfaction, making a notation in the leather-bound book he had begun keeping, a ledger separate from the normal plantation records. Catherine glimpsed it once when he left it on his desk. The pages were ruled into columns with headings that made her stomach turn. Physical characteristics, estimated intelligence, projected value, disposition, breeding, potential. But Ruth was only the first. In April, Nathaniel selected another woman, Grace, who was just 19. Then, May, a woman named Dinah, who worked in the kitchen. Catherine was required to be present each time to observe and record. She developed a system of dissociation, a way of separating her mind from what her eyes witnessed. She would focus on irrelevant details. A crack in the plaster wall, the sound of night insects outside the window, the smell of lamp oil burning low, anything but the horror unfolding before her. The other enslaved people at Sweetwater knew what was happening, of course. How could they not? The women who were selected moved through their daily work with hollowed eyes. The men who were husbands, or brothers or friends could do nothing, their rage forced into silence by the ever-present threat of violence or sale. The plantation's atmosphere changed. Where there had been the usual rhythms of forced labor and coerced cooperation, now there was something darker. A tension that hummed beneath every interaction. And then in July, a visitor arrived who would transform Nathaniel's private obsession into something far more systematic and sinister. Dr. Cornelius Harrove came to Sweetwater on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage rattling up the Oaklandine Drive trailing red dust. He was affiliated with the Medical Society of South Carolina in Charleston, though Catherine later learned his credentials were murky at best. Harrove was in his 52s, portly with mutton chop whiskers, and soft hands that had probably never delivered a difficult birth or set a broken bone. His specialty, he explained, over dinner that first evening, was what he called anthropological medicine, the study of racial characteristics and their transmission through bloodlines. Nathaniel had been corresponding with Harrove for months, ever since reading one of the doctor's papers in a Charleston medical journal. The paper, titled Observations on the Hereditary Transmission of Physical and Mental Characteristics in the Negro Race, proposed that through careful documentation and selection, planters could cultivate more valuable enslaved populations. It was pseudo-science of the vilest sort, but it was taken seriously in certain circles, published in respectable journals, discussed in the parlors of educated men who believed they were advancing human knowledge. Grove stayed at Sweetwater for 3 weeks. That summer, he examined every enslaved person on the plantation, measuring skulls with brass calipers, recording the texture of hair, the shape of noses, the color of eyes. He conducted interviews, though calling them that dignified the process too much. He asked questions designed to assess intelligence and temperament, then recorded his conclusions in dense paragraphs filled with scientific-sounding terminology. Catherine was required to assist him, to hold his instruments, to record his measurements in a separate ledger he had brought. She watched him work with growing horror. He showed particular interest in the children already born at Sweetwater, measuring them with the same cold precision, making predictions about their future value and utility. He discussed them as if they were a crop to be cultivated, variables in an experiment to be optimized. In the evenings, Hargrove and Nathaniel would sit in the study, door closed, voices low. Catherine learned to listen at the door, though what she heard made her wish for ignorance. They were planning something larger than Nathaniel's initial project. Harrove knew other planters, he said, men of vision who understood that the future of Greek Southern prosperity lay in scientific management of their human property. A network could be established. Information could be shared. Children with desirable characteristics could be traded or sold to continue breeding lines. It was Ruth who first told Catherine about the other thing that was happening, the thing that would prove even more disturbing than the breeding program itself. Ruth came to Catherine one morning in late August when Nathaniel and Harrove had written into Milledgeville for the day. Ruth was 4 months pregnant, her condition beginning to show beneath her loose work dress. She stood in the doorway of Catherine's morning room, twisting her hands, clearly terrified, but driven by something stronger than fear. "Mrs." Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about the babies, the ones that have been born here before you came." Catherine's breath caught. She had assumed, though never asked directly, that there had been other children fathered by Nathaniel or his father in previous years. It was too common to even remark upon. But the way Ruth said it, the fear in her eyes suggested something more. "Tell me," Catherine said. "Master Brennan, he'd been selecting certain babies," Ruth continued. "The ones with lighter skin, or different eyes, or other things Dr. Harrove looking for. After they born, after their mamas recover, men come in wagons at night. Take the babies away. Tell the mass they being sold, but they don't never say where. And, Mrs., we ask other folks at neighboring plantations, when we allowed to visit, and none of them ever see these babies. They just gone." The room tilted. Catherine gripped the arm of her chair. "How many?" she managed to ask. "I don't know exacts. Maybe 20, 25 over the years. Started before the old master, Brennan, died, but it gotten more since Dr. Harrove started coming around." Catherine dismissed Ruth with a shaking hand and sat alone in her morning room. As sunlight crept across the floor, she thought of the ledger Nathaniel kept, the one with columns for projected value. She thought of Harrove's network of planters, his talk of optimizing bloodlines, and she understood with sudden sickening clarity that what was happening at Sweetwater was not just about producing more enslaved workers for profit. It was something else entirely, something that treated human children as experimental subjects, as merchandise to be distributed according to some grand design that existed only in the twisted logic of men who believed science sanctified their atrocities. That night, when Nathaniel returned from Milledgeville, Catherine confronted him. It was the only time in their marriage she directly challenged him. She asked about the children, about where they went, about what he and Harrove were really doing. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes cold in the lamplight. Then he backhanded her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She fell against the settee, tasting blood, hearing him say in that calm, reasonable voice he always used, "You will never question me again, Catherine. You are part of this now. Your observations, your records, they are essential to the work. You are complicit. If you speak of this to anyone, if you try to interfere, I will have you committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. I have already spoken to a judge who is a friend of mine. One word from me, and you will spend the rest of your life in chains, being treated as the mad woman you are threatening to become." Catherine wiped the blood from her mouth and said nothing, but something changed in her that night. Some final thread of submission snapped. If she was complicit, if she could not escape or expose this without destroying herself, then she would find another way. She would become something other than a victim. She would become an instrument of justice, slow and careful and deadly. The late summer of 1837 brought storms that hammered the Georgia Piedmont with rain and lightning. Cotton crops rotted in the fields throughout Baldwin County. Planters gathered at the courthouse in Milledgeville, their voices tight with worry about markets and yields and the labor required to salvage what they could. Nathaniel attended these meetings, playing the part of concerned neighbor, while privately his attention remained fixed on his experiment, which weather could not interrupt. Grace gave birth in September to a boy with unusually light skin and eyes that would eventually settle into a gray-green shade. Harrove was present for the Blenksarov-Lurkin delivery, examining the infant with the same cold precision he applied to everything, making notations in his journal. Nathaniel was pleased. This child, he told Catherine, showed exactly the characteristics they were cultivating. Within a week, men came at night, as Ruth had described. Catherine watched from an upstairs window as they loaded a bundle into a covered wagon and drove away toward the South Road. Grace was given 2 days to recover, then sent back to the fields. She moved like something broken, her milk swollen, breasts bound tight beneath her dress, her eyes focused on nothing. Catherine had begun her own documentation by then. While Nathaniel and Harrove kept their official records, Catherine started a beat-blank, secret diary that went beyond simple observation. She recorded the women's names, their children's names, approximate dates of birth. She noted which children disappeared and tried to piece together patterns. She also began studying the medicinal herbs in her garden with new purpose, reading through the books her mother had given her about natural remedies and their properties. She paid particular attention to plants with cumulative effects, substances that might cause illness gradually over time, impossible to distinguish from natural ailments. Foxglove, for instance, which grew wild in the woods, around sweet water. In small doses, it could strengthen a failing heart. In slightly larger doses, administered regularly, it could cause weakness, confusion, nausea, slowly poisoning someone without detection required patience and precision. Catherine had both. By October, Ruth gave birth to a girl. This child had darker skin, more typical features. Nathaniel seemed disappointed. Harrove examined the baby and made his notations, his tone suggesting this one was less valuable to their purposes. No, men came for this child. She stayed with Ruth, given the name Martha. Catherine felt obscene relief that this baby at least would remain with her mother, even though remaining meant a life of enslavement at Sweetwater. Dinah's labor came in November and went badly. The baby, a boy, was born dead. Dinah hemorrhaged, and despite Catherine's attempts to help, died 3 days later. Catherine cleaned the blood from Dinah's quarters herself, her hands shaking as she scrubbed. She had genuinely tried to save Dinah, had used every skill she possessed, but it was not enough. The guilt was crushing. She had stood by and watched Dinah be violated, had recorded it in Nathaniel's ledger, and now the woman was dead. Catherine vomited into a bucket in the laundry room and emerged with her face carefully composed, because showing weakness was not permitted at Sweetwater. Nathaniel seemed more annoyed by the loss than grieved. He had invested time and resources in Dinah's pregnancy, and the result was nothing. He made a notation in his ledger about complications to avoid in future selections. Harrow suggested examining Dinah's body to determine the cause of failure, but Nathaniel overruled him. The enslaved community needed to see at least the pretense of respect for their dead, he said. Or there would be problems with morale and efficiency. They buried Diner in the small cemetery, behind the quarters, a plot marked with wooden crosses and rough stones. Catherine attended the burial, standing apart from the enslaved people who sang hymns in low voices. She watched Ruth, holding baby Martha, watched the way the women touched Grace's shoulder in silent solidarity, watched the men standing, with fists clenched and faces carefully blank. She felt their hatred directed at her as much as at Nathaniel, and she did not blame them. She was complicit. She had done nothing to stop any of this, but she was preparing. Each week, she collected small amounts of foxglove leaves, drying them carefully, grinding them to powder. She added them in tiny quantities to Nathaniel's evening whiskey. Not enough to make him obviously sick, just enough to make him feel poorly, to gradually weaken him. She told herself it was justice. She told herself she was doing what had to be done. The truth was more complicated. She was becoming something she did not recognize, driven by rage and guilt and a desperate need to strike back at the desperate man who had turned her into a witness to atrocities. Winter came early that year. By December, frost killed the last of the garden plants. Catherine collected the final foxglove seeds, storing them carefully for next year. She had learned patience, revenge. She understood now was not a sudden act, but a long campaign. She could wait. She had nothing but time and hatred to sustain her. Harrove returned to Sweetwater for the Christmas season, bringing with him documents that he and Nathaniel studied. In the locked study, Catherine did not know what those papers contained, but she knew they related to the network. Harrove had mentioned connections with other plantations, other men conducting similar experiments. She imagined a web spreading across the South, children being moved like chess pieces, all in service of some grand theory about racial purity and scientific progress that was really just cruelty dressed in academic language. On Christmas Eve, the enslaved people were given a holiday, as was customary. They gathered in the quarters for their own celebration, such as it could be under the circumstances. Catherine watched from the house as they sang and tried to find moments of joy. Despite everything, Ruth held Martha close, swaying to the music. Grace stood alone at the edge of the group, staring at nothing. Catherine turned away from the window and poured herself a glass of wine. Her hands steady now. She had moved past horror into something colder and more determined. The new year of 1838 arrived, with freezing rain that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone confined. Nathaniel and Hargrove spent long hours planning the expansion of their project. Catherine spent her time documenting everything, building her secret record, and adding tiny amounts of poison to her husband's drinks. The foxglove was working, but slowly. Nathaniel had begun complaining of fatigue, occasional nausea, a general malaise he attributed to the winter weather. No doctor was called. Why would he call a doctor for something so minor? Catherine smiled at him over the breakfast table and asked if he wanted more coffee. He did. She poured it carefully, her hands perfectly steady, and watched him drink it down. What do you think Catherine should do? Could you maintain the same composure in her situation? Let us know in the comments. And if this story is pulling you in, hit that like button and share this with someone who appreciates dark, historical tales. Let's continue discovering what happened at Sweetwater Plantation. March of 1838 brought false spring to Middle Georgia, warm days that coaxed early buds from the fruit trees before late frosts killed them. Nathaniel's health continued its gradual decline. He moved more slowly now, complained of weakness in his limbs, difficulty concentrating. Catherine suggested he see a doctor in Milledgeville, but he refused, insisting it was merely the lingering effects of winter. His pride would not allow him to admit vulnerability. Harrove noticed during his April visit, the doctor examined Nathaniel in the study. Catherine, not present for once, and emerged, looking concerned. He recommended reduced physical activity, better nutrition, perhaps a tonic. He wrote out a prescription for a compound that could be obtained from an apothecary in town. Catherine collected the prescription and filled it, but she also began reducing the foxglove doses. She did not want Nathaniel dead yet. She wanted him weak, dependent, unable to continue his breeding program with the same vigor. She wanted him to suffer as she had suffered, to lose control of his body as he had taken control of others' bodies. But her plans were complicated by a new development. 2 women were pregnant again, Ruth for a second time, and a woman named Pearl, who worked in the main house as a chambermaid. Pearl was 26, educated by previous owners who had taught her to read before economic troubles forced them to sell her south. She was intelligent, observant, and Catherine had noticed the way Pearl watched everything, filing away information as if she, too, were keeping records. Catherine began to feel a strange kinship with Pearl, though they could never acknowledge it openly. Both were trapped in Sweetwater's nightmare. Both were documenting it in their own ways. Both were waiting for something to change. When they passed in hallways, Pearl's eyes would meet Catherine's for just a moment, a communication without words. They understood each other. It was Pearl who finally told Catherine about Samuel. One morning in late April, when Nathaniel and Harrove had ridden into Milledgeville for a meeting with other planters, Catherine found Pearl alone in the laundry room, washing linens in water gone gray with soap. Catherine sent the other workers away on pretended errands, waiting until she and Pearl were alone before speaking. "I know you have been watching," Catherine said quietly. "I know you see everything that happens here just as I do, and I know you understand what my husband is doing." Pearl's hands stilled in the wash water. She looked at Catherine with those intelligent eyes, assessing, calculating risk. After a long moment, she said carefully, "What is it you want to know, Mrs.? Everything you think I should know? Everything that might help me stop this?" Pearl glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone. Then she spoke in a low voice, her words precise despite the danger of what she was revealing. "There is something Master Brennan has kept hidden from you. A boy. His name is Samuel. He was born 8 years ago before you came to Sweetwater. His mama was a woman named Judith, who worked in the house. Master Brennan kept Samuel because he was the first one born, looking almost white with gray eyes and light hair like his own. Judith got sold away to Alabama when Samuel was weaned, and the boy has been living in a cabin apart from the rest of us ever since." Catherine felt ice spreading through her chest. "Why have I never seen this child? Master Brennan keeps him separate. He has been teaching Samuel things, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, things he does not allow the rest of us to learn. I have heard him and Dr. Harrove talking about the boy. They say Samuel is proof that their breeding theories work," and Mrs. Pearl's voice dropped even lower. "They are planning to use him. When he gets older, when he reaches manhood, they plan to have him father children himself. They want to create a whole line of people who look white but are still property under the law. People they can sell for fortunes to buyers who want servants that can pass in white society." The horror of it struck Catherine like a physical blow. Nathaniel had fathered a son and was grooming that child to continue the cycle of exploitation, to become another instrument of the same violation that had brought him into existence. It was a legacy of trauma designed to perpetuate itself across generations. Where is this boy kept? Catherine asked. In a cabin on the east side of the property, past the barn. Master Brennan visits him most afternoons for lessons. But Mrs. Yu should know Samuel is smart. Real smart. He understands what he is. What Master Brennan plans for him. I have seen the look in that boy's eyes. He is angry and he is waiting for something. I do not know what, but he is not the obedient tool Master Brennan thinks he has created. Catherine left the laundry room with Pearl's words echoing in her mind. Samuel, a son Nathaniel had kept, trained, shaped for some darker purpose. She needed to see this boy to understand what 8 years under Nathaniel's instruction had created. That evening at dinner, Catherine took a calculated risk. She mentioned casually that she had heard there was a child at Sweetwater receiving an education. How unusual that seemed. Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his gray eyes fixing on her with sudden sharpness. Where did you hear that? His voice was controlled, but she heard the warning beneath it. Servants talk, Catherine said with practiced indifference. I pay attention to my household. Nathaniel set down his fork. With deliberate care. Samuel is part of the project, an experiment in potential. He demonstrates what careful selection and proper training can produce. I would like to meet him. No? Catherine met his gaze steadily. I have been present for every other aspect of this work. I have documented births, recorded characteristics, witnessed things that will haunt me until I die. Why should I not meet this child who is apparently so important to your vision? The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. She could see him calculating, weighing whether her request posed any real threat. His illness had made him more cautious, less certain of his control. Finally, he nodded once. Tomorrow afternoon. But you will observe only. You will not speak to him unless I permit it, and you will certainly not interfere with his education. The next day, dragged with anticipation that bordered on dread, Catherine moved through her morning tasks mechanically, her mind focused on the coming meeting. When Nathaniel finally came to collect her after the midday meal, she followed him across the yard toward a cabin set apart from the slave quarters. It was better built than the others, with glass windows instead of shutters, and a small porch with actual steps. Inside, the space was spare but clean. A narrow bed. In one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding books that Catherine recognized from Nathaniel's own library, and at a small desk near the window, a boy sat working through arithmetic problems on a slate, his handwriting neat and precise. Samuel looked up when they entered. Catherine's breath caught. The resemblance to Nathaniel was unmistakable in the angular face, the set of the jaw, those pale gray eyes. But his skin was lighter than she had expected, light enough that in different clothes, in a different context, he might pass unquestioned in white society. His hair was brown with golden undertones falling across his forehead as he studied them. Samuel, this is Mrs. Brennan, Nathaniel said. His voice carried a tone Catherine had never heard before, something almost like pride. The boy stood smoothly, executing a formal bow that spoke of careful instruction. Good afternoon, Mrs. Brennan. His diction was perfect, without the dialect that marked most enslaved people's speech. Someone had worked hard to train that out of him. It is good to meet you, Samuel. Catherine managed. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask him questions, wanted to understand what this child thought and felt behind that carefully neutral expression. But Nathaniel was watching her closely. For the next half hour, Nathaniel demonstrated Samuel's abilities like a man showing off a prized horse. The boy read passages from books well beyond what most 8-year-olds could manage. He worked through mathematical problems with ease. He answered questions about history and geography with accuracy that suggested hours of study. And through it all, his face remained a mask, revealing nothing. When they finally left, walking back toward the main house, Nathaniel spoke with barely contained satisfaction. You see, he is proof that the theories are sound. With proper breeding and education, exceptional results are possible. In another 10 years, when he reaches maturity, he will be ready for the next phase. What next phase? Catherine asked, though cold certainty was already forming in her gut. He will father children of his own, of course. I have been corresponding with Calloway about potential matches. There are several plantations with girls from similar breeding programs. We will create pairings based on optimal characteristics. Samuel's children will represent the culmination of everything we have learned. Catherine stopped walking. You are planning to use your own son as breeding stock. He is not my son in any legal sense. Nathaniel said calmly, he is property, exceptionally valuable property, but property nonetheless, and he will fulfill the braid's purpose for which he was created. It is no different than using a prize bull to improve one's cattle. He is a child, a human child. Nathaniel's expression hardened. He is a tool in a grand experiment. Do not allow yourself to become sentimental, Catherine. Sentiment has no place in scientific progress. That night, Catherine sat in her room, with her hidden diary open before her, but found herself unable to write. The horror of what Nathaniel planned for Samuel seemed to dwarf even the other atrocities. This was not just exploitation or trafficking. This was the creation of a self-perpetuating system of abuse designed to continue across generations. Samuel would be forced to inflict on others what had been inflicted upon his mother, creating children who would themselves be trapped in the same cycle. She had to find a way to stop it. But how? Nathaniel held all the power. The law was entirely on his side. Even if she somehow managed to help Samuel escape, where would he go? How would a light-skinned child of ambiguous status survive in a world that demanded clear categories? The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and terrible. She needed an ally with real power, someone whose moral authority carried weight, someone who could not be easily dismissed or threatened. She needed someone from outside the plantation system, someone with connections beyond Georgia. She needed a minister. The Reverend Thomas Gaines arrived in Milledgeville in early August, assigned to the Presbyterian Church by the Northern Synod. He was 35, unmarried, a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, with what the local congregation would soon learn were dangerously progressive views on slavery. Not abolitionist exactly. He was too careful for that. But he preached about Christian duty, about treating all people as children of God, about the spiritual dangers of absolute power. Catherine attended his first sermon and sat in the Brennan family pew, listening, as he spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan with emphasis that made several plantation owners shift uncomfortably. After the service, she approached him in the receiving line, introduced herself with perfect propriety, and mentioned that she would value his counsel on some difficult spiritual matters. Reverend Gaines had intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than people wanted to reveal. I would be honored, Mrs. Brennan. Shall I call at Sweetwater? That would be most appropriate, Catherine said, aware of Nathaniel watching from across the church lawn. My husband and I would be pleased to receive you. The minister's first visit came the following Tuesday. Catherine had prepared carefully, ensuring that Nathaniel would be present for the initial meeting, that everything would appear perfectly normal and proper. They sat in the front parlor, drinking tea, discussing theology and church matters with the careful politeness of strangers establishing boundaries. But when Reverend Gaines asked if he might tour the plantation to better understand the lives of his potential congregants, Catherine saw her opening. Nathaniel could hardly refuse, without appearing suspicious, so he agreed with poorly concealed reluctance. Catherine led the tour with Nathaniel, trailing behind, his breathing labored from the exertion. She made sure they passed the slave quarters at a time when people would be visible. Ruth was there, holding little Martha, now a year old. Grace stood at her cabin door, that hollow look in her eyes that never changed. Pearl moved between buildings, her pregnancy now obvious, her movements careful and deliberate. You have a large population here, Reverend Gaines observed. His tone was neutral, but Catherine saw how his gaze lingered on the women, on the children, cataloging details. Sweetwater is prosperous, Nathaniel said. We manage our resources efficiently. Resources, the minister repeated softly. Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe people. The tension in that moment was palpable. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They completed the tour and returned to the house where Reverend Gaines took his leave with promises to return soon for further spiritual discussions. After the minister's carriage disappeared down the drive, Nathaniel turned to Catherine. What are you doing? Seeking spiritual guidance, Catherine said calmly. Is that not what a Christian woman should do? You have made me party to many things, Nathaniel. My conscience requires counsel. Be careful, Catherine, very careful. But the minister did return again and again over the following weeks. Sometimes Nathaniel was present for their discussions, sitting in his study as they talked theology. Other times, Nathaniel's increasing fatigue kept him to his room, and Catherine met with Reverend Gaines alone in the parlor with Pearl serving tea, her presence a silent reminder of what they were really discussing. Catherine was careful. She never spoke directly about the breeding program, never made explicit accusations. Instead, she asked theoretical questions. What was a Christian's duty when witnessing sin? What should one do when complicit in evil but powerless to stop it? How did one balance obedience to earthly authority against obedience to divine law? Reverend Gaines was equally careful in his responses, but Catherine could see understanding dawning in his eyes. He began asking his own questions, gentle and indirect, about the children at Sweetwater, about their fathers, about what happened to babies born on the plantation. Catherine answered with vague gestures and meaningful silences, letting him piece together the truth. In mid-September, Pearl went into labor. It happened in the afternoon, sudden and hard. Catherine attended the birth as she always did now, her presence required by Nathaniel even though he himself stayed away from the actual delivery. Pearl labored for 6 hours, her face slick with sweat, her hands gripping the bed frame until her knuckles went white. When the baby finally came, a girl with skin lighter than Pearl's but darker than Samuel's, Catherine wrapped the infant and placed her in her mother's arms. Her name is Grace, Pearl said, her voice from screaming after the first one who lost everything. Catherine looked at this woman who had helped her, who had shared information at great risk, who had just endured agony to bring forth a child she might not be allowed to keep. I will not let them take her, Catherine said, quietly. I promise you, Pearl, whatever it costs me, I will not let them take this baby. It was a rash promise, perhaps an impossible one, but she meant it. She had stood by too long, witnessed too much. If she could not save all the children who had already been stolen, she could at least fight for this one. That night, Nathaniel came to inspect Pearl's baby. He brought his ledger, making his usual notations about characteristics and potential value. Catherine watched him with barely concealed rage. When he finished and turned to leave, she followed him to his study. This one stays, Catherine said. Nathaniel looked up from his desk. That is not your decision. I am making it my decision. Pearl's baby will not be sold. She will remain here with her mother. And if I disagree, then I will go to Reverend Gaines and tell him everything, every detail of your breeding program, every child sold through Calloway's network, every aspect of your grand experiment. I will give him documentation with names and dates. I will destroy you, Nathaniel. It was a dangerous gambit. Nathaniel could still have her, committed, could still silence her through force or institutionalization. But his illness had weakened him, and they both knew it. More importantly, Reverend Gaines's presence in Milledgeville had changed the calculation. The minister had connections to the Northern Church, to people who might actually listen. If accusations were made by a clergyman rather than a supposedly hysterical woman. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. You think you have power here? You think you can dictate terms to me in my own house? I think we both have something to lose, Catherine said, and I think you are practical enough to recognize a stalemate when you see one. Pearl's baby stays. That is the price for my continued silence. One child. That is all you ask. Catherine hesitated, then pressed further. And no more women selected for your program. What has been done is done, but no more. You ask me to abandon years of work. I ask you to stop committing evil in the name of science. If you refuse, I will ensure that everything you have built comes crashing down, even if it destroys me in the process. The standoff lasted for days. Nathaniel said neither yes nor simply, withdrawing into cold silence. Catherine held firm, continuing her meetings with Reverend Gaines, continuing to document everything in her hidden diary. Pearl remained in her cabin with baby Grace, suspended in uncertainty, not knowing whether the child would be taken in the night as so many others had been. Then, one evening in late September, everything changed. Just when we thought Catherine had gained some small measure of control over the horrors at Sweetwater, new complications emerge that will test her resolve and her courage to their absolute limits. If this story is gripping you, share it with someone who appreciates complex historical mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden past. The darkest revelations are still ahead. Reverend Gaines arrived at Sweetwater unannounced on a Thursday morning, his face grave. Catherine received him in the front parlor, immediately sensing that something had shifted. The minister waited until Pearl had served coffee and departed before speaking. I have been making inquiries, he said quietly, about the matters we have discussed. I spoke with colleagues in Savannah and Charleston, with people who might know about certain networks operating between plantations. Catherine's pulse quickened. And what did you learn? Enough to trouble me deeply. Enough to suggest that what happens here is part of something larger and more organized than isolated incidents of immorality. Mrs. Brennan, I need you to tell me directly. Our children being bred deliberately at Sweetwater and then sold into trafficking networks. Catherine had spent weeks building up to this moment, preparing careful half-truths and implications. But faced with the direct question with this man who genuinely seemed to care about justice, she found herself unable to maintain the pretense. Yes, she said simply. My husband and a doctor from Charleston named Harrove have been conducting what they call a breeding experiment. They select women. My husband fathers children, and those with certain characteristics are sold through a man named Edmund Calloway to buyers in the Caribbean and South America. I have been forced to witness and document everything. I have records, Reverend Gaines, names, dates, physical descriptions, evidence of at least 40 children who have disappeared from this plantation over the past decade. The minister's face had gone pale. God, in heaven, and you have proof of this. I have documentation, but I have not yet determined what to do with it. If I go to local authorities, they will dismiss me as a hysterical woman, or my husband will have me committed to the lunatic asylum. The law gives him every right to do with his property as he wishes, and that includes both the enslaved people and to a large extent me. Reverend Gaines stood and paced to the window, looking out over the grounds of Sweetwater. This is worse than I imagined. What you describe is not merely the sin of slavery, which is bad enough, but a systematic abuse that turns human beings into experimental subjects, into merchandise, in a trafficking scheme. Yes, Catherine said, that is exactly what it is. I need to see your documentation, and then we need to determine how to proceed. There are people in Atlanta, in the state government, who might listen. There are federal prosecutors who handle smuggling cases. If we can prove international trafficking, there might be legal recourse even in Georgia. Catherine felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. I will get you the documents, but Reverend, you must understand the risk. My husband has threatened me, and he has connections throughout this region. If he learns what we are planning, then we must be very careful, the minister said, and we must move quickly. They made plans for Catherine to copy portions of her documentation and pass them to Reverend Gaines during his next official visit. He would take them to contacts in Atlanta and Savannah, people he trusted to handle such explosive information properly. It would take time, weeks, or possibly months, to build a case strong enough to overcome the legal and social protections Nathaniel enjoyed. But it was a start. Catherine should have known that secrets at Sweetwater never stayed hidden for long. 2 days after Reverend Gaines's visit, Catherine was in her morning room working on her needlework, a pretense of normalcy she maintained, even as her mind raced with plans and possibilities. When Nathaniel entered, without knocking, his face was flushed, despite his usual pallor, his eyes bright with anger. You have been corresponding with the minister, he said. It was not a question. Catherine's hands stilled on her embroidery. He is our clergyman. Of course, I speak with him. Do not play games with me, Catherine. I know what you are doing. I know you have been feeding him information about our private affairs. Your affairs? Catherine corrected. I have merely been seeking spiritual counsel on matters that trouble my conscience. Nathaniel crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. You will cease all contact with Reverend Gaines. You will not speak to him again, at church or anywhere else. You will not write to him. You will not continue whatever scheme you have concocted. Catherine met his eyes steadily, refusing to flinch, though his grip was painful. Or what, Nathaniel? Will you lock me away? We have had this conversation before. I have taken precautions. If anything happens to me, if I suddenly disappear or fall, mysteriously ill, information will reach people you cannot control. You think yourself so clever, Nathaniel hissed. But you forget that I control everything. In this house, every person, every action, every breath you take. He released her wrist, and she resisted the urge to rub the Reen skin. After he left, Catherine sat very still, thinking through the implications. Nathaniel knew she was working against him, which meant he would be watching her more carefully, making it harder to pass information to Reverend Gaines. She needed another way to communicate, another channel that Nathaniel could not easily monitor. The answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, Samuel appeared at the kitchen door asking for Pearl. It was unusual. The boy rarely approached the main house, but when Pearl emerged, he spoke to her in a low voice, pressed something into her hand, and departed quickly. Pearl found Catherine later and showed her what Samuel had given her, a folded piece of paper with careful handwriting. The message was brief. I know what my father plans for me. I want to help stop him. I can carry messages. He does not watch me closely. Catherine stared at the note, her heart pounding. Samuel, 8 years old, was offering to become a courier in a conspiracy against his own father. The risk to him was enormous. If Nathaniel discovered it, the punishment would be severe. But it was also an opportunity she could not ignore. Tell him yes, Catherine said to Pearl. Tell him to be extremely careful, and tell him I am grateful for his courage. Through September and into October, a delicate network of communication developed. Samuel carried messages between Catherine and Reverend Gaines, hiding them in the books he borrowed from Nathaniel's library, retrieving responses tucked into volumes he returned. It was slow and dangerous, but it worked. Catherine passed copies of her documentation page by page, and Reverend Gaines took them to his contacts in Atlanta. But the strain was showing on everyone. Pearl moved through her days with constant vigilance. Baby Grace, always close, her eyes darting at every sound. Ruth had grown gaunt and silent, barely speaking even to other enslaved people. Grace continued her hollow existence, a ghost moving through the cotton fields, and Catherine felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. Every decision she made put others at risk. Every step forward increased the danger. The crisis came on. A cool morning in mid-October, Catherine was in the garden collecting the last herbs before the first hard frost when she heard shouting from the direction of the slave quarters. She ran toward the sound and found Nathaniel in a rage standing over Samuel, who was on his knees in the dirt. Explain this. Nathaniel held up a piece of paper. One of Catherine's messages. Samuel must have dropped it or failed to hide it properly. The boy said nothing. His face, a mask, even as blood trickled from his split lip where Nathaniel had struck him. Catherine forced herself to walk forward calmly, her heart hammering. Nathaniel, what is happening? This boy, Nathaniel spat, this ungrateful creature I have educated and sheltered has been sneaking messages about my private business. Messages meant for that meddling minister. Catherine's mind raced. If Nathaniel knew about the messages, he would know she was behind them. The entire plan was compromised. But she could not let Samuel take the full punishment for following her orders. I asked him to carry them, Catherine said clearly. He was following my instructions. Nathaniel turned to her, his face purple with rage. You admit it? I admit nothing, except asking a child to perform a simpler errand. If you have constructed some elaborate conspiracy in your mind, that is your concern, not mine. You have betrayed me. After everything, after all, my warnings, you have conspired against me. I have sought spiritual counsel and shared my concerns with a minister of God. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should examine your own actions rather than condemning mine. The confrontation was building to something terrible. Catherine could see Nathaniel's hands shaking, could see the violence barely contained beneath his fury. Pearl had emerged from a nearby cabin, holding baby Grace, her face stricken with fear. Other enslaved people had stopped their work, watching from a safe distance. And then Nathaniel made his decision. Samuel, go to your cabin and wait there. You will be dealt with later. To the overseer who had come, running at the commotion, fetch Dr. Phillips from Milledgeville. My wife has been suffering from delusions and hysteria. It is time she received proper medical attention. Catherine felt ice flood through her veins. This was the threat Nathaniel had held over her since the beginning. The ultimate weapon he could deploy to silence her completely. Commitment to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, where she would be locked away possibly for years, possibly forever, labeled as insane, stripped of all credibility. You cannot do this, Catherine said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I can do whatever is necessary to protect my household and my interests, Nathaniel replied. You have proven yourself incapable of rational thought. You have become a danger to yourself and to the proper order of this plantation. I'm acting out of concern for your welfare. The overseer had already departed toward the stable to saddle a horse. Within an hour, Dr. Phillips would be on his way from town. Catherine had perhaps 60 minutes to prevent the destruction of everything she had worked toward. She looked at Samuel still, kneeling in the dirt, at Pearl holding baby Grace, at Ruth standing in her cabin doorway with Martha clinging to her skirts, at all the faces watching this confrontation, all the people whose lives would continue in suffering if she failed now. I have documentation, Catherine said quietly, of everything. Every woman you violated, every child born and stolen, every transaction with Calloway, every conversation with Harrove about your breeding experiments. I have names, dates, amounts paid. I do have copied letters describing your international trafficking network, and I have given all of it to Reverend Gaines, with explicit instructions to send copies to newspapers in Charleston, Savannah, and Atlanta, to the state attorney general, to federal marshals, and to church authorities throughout the South if anything happens to me. Nathaniel's face went from purple to pale. You are lying. Am I? Catherine walked closer to him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You taught me to observe, to document, to plan with patience. Did you truly believe I was doing that only for your benefit? I have been building a case against you for over a year. Every time you forced me to witness your crimes, I was recording with them. Every conversation you had with Harrove and Calloway that you thought I was not paying attention to, I was memorizing. Every child that disappeared. In the night, I noted the date and description. No one would believe you, Nathaniel said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Perhaps not if I were alone, but Reverend Gaines believes me, and he has connections to people in Atlanta, in the federal government, in newspapers that are not controlled by plantation interests. Even in the South, Nathaniel, there are limits to what people will tolerate. Slavery is one thing. It is legal, sanctioned, woven into our economy. But international, child trafficking, organized breeding, programs documented like livestock, experiments, that is something else. Entirely, that is scandalous enough to bring scrutiny even here. Pearl stepped forward, still holding baby Grace. Mrs. Catherine is not the only one with records, she said clearly. I have been writing too. So has Samuel. So have others. We may be enslaved, but we can read and write. And we have been documenting everything. You think we are property that cannot testify, but written records are different. And if something happens to Mrs. Catherine, if she disappears into that asylum, we will make sure those records reach people who will publish them. It was a tremendous risk for Pearl to speak so directly, but Catherine understood the strategy. This was not just Catherine's word anymore. This was multiple sources, multiple forms of documentation. A case that could not be easily dismissed as one woman's hysteria. Nathaniel looked at the enslaved people gathering around the scene, looked at Samuel still kneeling in the dirt, looked at Catherine standing firm despite her terror. For the first time since Catherine had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. What do you want? He finally asked. I want you to stop, Catherine said. Completely. No more women selected for breeding, no more children taken, and sold. No more participation in Callaway's network. Samuel will continue his education, but will be legally freed when he reaches 21 and documented in your will. The women who have borne children here will be treated with basic humanity, and their children allowed to remain with them, and you will live with what you have done, knowing that if you violate any of these conditions, everything becomes public. You ask me to dismantle everything I have built. I am not asking. I am telling you the price of avoiding scandal and prosecution. You can accept these terms, or you can try to have me committed and discover whether my documentation reaches authorities before you can silence me. Those are your only choices. The standoff lasted for an eternal moment. The morning sun had climbed higher, making shadows shorter, but the scene felt frozen in time. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. An enslaved woman speaking truth to a master, a wife threatening her husband, with evidence of his crimes, a conspiracy that crossed every social boundary. Nathaniel's face worked through a series of expressions: rage, calculation, frustration, and finally, cold resignation. Very well, he said at last. But understand this, Catherine, you have won a battle, not the war. We will live here together in this stalemate, and I will make sure you suffer for this betrayal in every way I can devise that does not violate your explicit conditions. You will remain my wife, trapped in this house, complicit in everything that has already been done. That guilt will eat at you for the rest of your life. Yes, Catherine agreed quietly. It will. I will carry the weight of what I witnessed and did not stop quickly. Enough. I will bear that burden until I die. But at least no more children will be stolen. At least the horror stops here today. That is the only redemption available to me. Nathaniel turned and walked back toward the main house, his gait unsteady, the morning's confrontation having clearly exhausted him. Catherine watched him go, then turned to Samuel. "Stand up," she said, gently. The boy rose, wiping blood from his lip. His gray eyes, so like his father's, met hers with an expression far too old for an 8-year-old. "Thank you, Mrs. Catherine," he said softly. "You were brave," Catherine told him. too brave for a child to need to be. I am sorry for the position I put you in. I wanted to help, Samuel said. I know what he planned for me. I know what I was supposed to become. He paused, then added with quiet intensity, I will not be what he wanted. I will not continue this. I promise you that. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She looked at Pearl, at baby Grace, sleeping in her mother's arms, at Ruth and Martha watching from their cabin. The enslaved community had witnessed everything, had seen one of their own speak directly to the master, had seen a white woman threaten her husband on their behalf. It changed nothing about their legal status, nothing about the fundamental injustice of their situation, but perhaps it offered some small measure of hope that resistance was possible, that the powerful were not entirely untouchable. When the overseer returned later that afternoon to report that he had been unable to find Dr. Phillips in town, Nathaniel simply waved him away. The crisis had passed. The asylum was no longer part of the plan. What remained was exactly what Catherine had described, a stalemate, a cold war. Within the walls of Sweetwater Plantation, two people bound together by shared crimes and mutual hatred, living out their days in a hell of their own creation. The years that followed were years of gray survival. Nathaniel kept his word because he had no choice, but he made Catherine's life miserable in every way his position permitted. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. He excluded her from all social events, telling friends she had become reclusive due to delicate health. He controlled her access to money, to correspondence, to everything beyond the immediate grounds of Sweetwater. But the breeding program stopped. No more women were selected. No more children were taken in the night. Pearl raised baby Grace in relative peace, teaching her daughter to read in secret, passing on skills that might someday lead to freedom. Ruth kept Martha close, finding some measure of comfort in watching her daughter grow. Grace continued her broken existence, but was at least spared further violation. Samuel continued his education, but now Catherine participated in it openly, bringing him books, teaching him herself. When Nathaniel's increasing illness prevented regular lessons, she watched the boy grow from 8 to 10 to 12, watched intelligence sharpen into keen perception, watched anger mature into determination. He would keep his promise. She knew he would not become what Nathaniel had intended. Nathaniel's health declined steadily. The damage Catherine's fox glove poisoning had done to his heart was irreversible. By 1841, he could barely manage the stairs without stopping to rest. By 1842, he had largely withdrawn to his study, managing the plantation through overseers and written instructions. Catherine did not but gloat over his deterioration. She felt nothing for him anymore, neither hatred nor pity, just a cold emptiness where emotion used to live. Reverend Gaines remained in Milledgeville, a steady presence and a reminder that the documentation still existed, that the threat of exposure remained real. Calloway's network had indeed collapsed. When federal authorities raided a plantation in South Carolina for smuggling violations and found records of the child trafficking operation, several planters fled the country. Grove disappeared, presumably to the Caribbean, where many slaveholders went. When things became too hot in the States, Catherine knew her victory was partial at best. The children who had already been taken were gone forever, lost in the slave markets of Cuba and Brazil, their fates unknown and unknowable. Grace would never recover from what had been done to her. Ruth would always carry the grief of her stolen son, and Catherine herself would always bear the guilt of having waited so long, of having been complicit for months before finally acting. In March of 1843, Nathaniel died. The doctor said, heart failure, which was accurate enough. He was 39 years old. They buried him in the family cemetery with minimal ceremony. Catherine stood at the grave in her black mourning dress and felt nothing except relief that it was over. His will, written in the final year of his life, left Sweetwater to Catherine with specific provisions about Samuel's education and eventual manumission at age 21. It was perhaps the only decent thing Nathaniel had ever done, acknowledging this son in the only way the law permitted, ensuring he would eventually gain freedom. Catherine suspected it was motivated less by love than by a desire to prove his theory had merit, that Samuel could succeed as a free man and thus validate the entire experiment. But the motivation did not matter. The result was what counted. Catherine lived on at Sweetwater for 11 more years. She never remarried. She managed the plantation as well as she could within slavery's constraints, treating the enslaved people with as much humanity as the system allowed, which was never enough. She established a small school where children could learn to read and write. Knowing this was technically illegal, but doing it anyway. She saved money and purchased freedom for Pearl and baby Grace in 1849, sending them north with letters of introduction to Quaker families in Philadelphia who helped refugees from slavery. Ruth asked to remain at Sweetwater with Martha. The plantation was the only home she knew, and she feared the uncertainty of freedom more than the familiar routines of enslavement. Catherine understood. Trauma makes people cling to what they know even when what they know is terrible. Samuel was freed in 1851 when he turned 21, as Nathaniel's will had specified. Catherine gave him money for travel, letters of introduction, and a copy of all the documentation about his origins. If you want to know where you came from, she told him, it is all here. But you are not defined by how you began. You can be whoever you choose to become. Samuel took the papers, thanked her, and left Sweetwater. He traveled north to Philadelphia, found work as a clerk, married a free black woman, and built a life under an assumed name. He never returned to Georgia. His children would grow up knowing they were descended from enslaved people, but not knowing the specific horror of their grandfather's breeding program. That knowledge died with Samuel in 1897, though researchers would eventually piece it together from the documents Catherine preserved. Catherine herself grew increasingly frail as the 1,850 seconds progressed. The years of stress, guilt, and constant vigilance had taken their toll. She developed a persistent cough that no amount of herbal remedies could cure. By the spring of 1854, she knew she was dying. Consumption, the doctor said, though. Catherine suspected it was something else, some deeper exhaustion of the spirit that manifested in the body. In her final weeks, she spent hours with her hidden diary, adding final entries, and organizing all the documentation she had accumulated. She wrote detailed instructions for her lawyer about how the papers should be sealed and preserved, stipulating they should not be opened for 100 years. She wanted the truth to be known eventually, but not so soon that it would destroy the lives of those still living who had been victims of Sweetwater's horrors. Ruth came to visit her in those last days, bringing Martha, now a young woman of 16. They sat beside Catherine's bed in comfortable silence. These three women who had been bound together by shared trauma, each carrying their portion of grief. Did we do enough? Catherine asked Ruth. Did stopping it when we did matter? Or was it too little too late? Ruth considered the question carefully before answering. You can't give back what was taken. Mrs. Catherine, my son is gone. Grace's boy is gone. All those babies disappeared into places we will never know. That cannot be undone. She paused, looking at Martha sitting quiet beside her. But my daughter is here. Pearl's daughter is free in Philadelphia. Samuel has a chance at a life. That is something. It is not redemption, maybe, but it is something. I should have acted sooner, Catherine whispered. The moment I understood what Nathaniel was doing, I should have found a way to stop him. Maybe, Ruth said, or maybe you would have died or been locked away and it would have continued anyway. We cannot know what would have happened in a different world. We only know what happened in this one. She reached out and took Catherine's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable under different circumstances. You did what you could when you could do it. That is all any of us can do. Catherine died on May 3rd, 1854 at the age of 42. She was buried beside Nathaniel in the family cemetery, an irony that would not have escaped her. Her will divided Sweetwater's land among the enslaved people who remained there, freeing all of them and giving them ownership of small parcels. It was challenged in court by distant Brennan relatives, and most of the formerly enslaved people eventually sold their portions because they lacked the capital to work the land and faced constant harassment from neighboring white landowners. But for a brief moment, the vision of justice Catherine had fought for was partially realized. The documentation she preserved, Nathaniel's ledgers, her hidden diary, the letters and records of Calloway's network, was sealed by her lawyer and placed in storage in the Baldwin County Courthouse. A note on the outside of the box read, "Not to be opened until 1954. County clerks transferred it from storage room to storage room over the decades. Its contents forgotten by everyone except a few archivists who maintained the courthouse records. The main house at Sweetwater burned in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ended. Whether it was accident, arson by former enslaved people, or deliberate destruction by Catherine's heirs, who could not bear what the place represented, no one recorded. The slave quarters were gradually dismantled, their lumber used for other buildings. The land was subdivided and sold to small farmers. The cemetery was neglected, overgrown with brambles and kudzu. By the early 20th century, few people in Baldwin County remembered that Sweetwater Plantation had ever existed. It became one of thousands of forgotten places where slavery's horrors had unfolded, its specific crimes lost to time and deliberate forgetting until 1954. A historian from the University of Georgia named Margaret Fletcher was researching antebellum plantation records for her dissertation. She was in the Baldwin County Courthouse going through old property records when she found the sealed box with its century-old instruction. Curious, she brought it to the county clerk's attention. After confirming that the 100 red year seal period had passed, they opened it. What they found shocked even researchers accustomed to slavery's documentation. Catherine's diary was the most damaging, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, but with precise details about dates, names, and transactions. Nathaniel's ledgers provided cold, scientific notation of his breeding program. Letters between Harrove, Calloway, and Nathaniel laid out the full scope of the trafficking network, and Pearl's hidden records written in tiny script on whatever scraps of paper she could find provided the enslaved people's perspective on what they had endured. Dr. Fletcher initially did not want to publish what she had found. The material was too disturbing, too inflammatory. But her advisors convinced her that this was exactly the kind of primary source documentation that needed to be preserved and studied no matter how painful. Her dissertation, completed in 1956, included extensive excerpts from the Sweetwater documents. It was published by a university press in 1958 under the title Sweetwater, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in antebellum Georgia. The book caused controversy. Some historians praised it for its unflinching examination of slavery's pseudoscientific justifications. Others criticized it as sensationalistic or accused Fletcher of focusing on extreme cases that were not representative of typical plantation management. Descendants of the Brennan family tried unsuccessfully to suppress publication, arguing it defamed their ancestors. But the documentation was real. The crimes had happened. And, slowly, over the following decades, other researchers began finding similar evidence at other plantations. Proof that what happened at Sweetwater was not unique, but part of a broader pattern of systematic exploitation masked by the dead language of science and progress. Samuel's descendants learned about their family's origins when Fletcher's book was published. His grandson, Robert Cunningham Samuel, had taken his wife's maiden name when they married, was a physician in Philadelphia. He read the book and finally understood why his grandfather had never spoken about his childhood, why he had seemed to carry such profound sadness beneath his successful life. Robert wrote to Fletcher thanking her for preserving the truth even though it was painful, and he provided family records that helped researchers trace what had happened to Samuel after he left Georgia. Pearl's granddaughter, a teacher in Boston, also contacted Fletcher after reading the book. She shared stories that Pearl had told her family about Sweetwater, about Catherine, about the resistance that happened in whispers and coded messages. These oral histories, combined with the written documentation, created a fuller the picture of how enslaved people survived and resisted even in the most horrific circumstances. Ruth's descendants were harder to trace. Martha had remained in Georgia, married, and had children, but the family had scattered during the early 20th century's Great Migration north. Some researchers believe they located Martha's great-granddaughter in Detroit in the 1970 seconds, but the connection was never definitively proven. Grace, the woman whose suffering had been so visible to Catherine, left no descendants. She died of pneumonia in 1862, still enslaved, still carrying the trauma of what had been done to her. Her name appears in Catherine's diary 47 times, always with notations about her condition, her silence, her hollowed-out existence. She represents the countless victims whose stories were not preserved, whose suffering left no mark, except in the memories of those who witnessed it. The story of Sweetwater forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It shows how evil can be rationalized through the great language of science and progress. It demonstrates how systems of oppression operate not just through open violence, but through bureaucratic organization, careful documentation, and networks of cooperation among people who believed they were advancing human knowledge. It reveals the limited options available, even to privileged women when they found themselves complicit in atrocities, had no legal power to stop. Catherine Brennan was not a hero in any simple sense. She waited too long. She was complicit in suffering, she documented, but did not immediately resist. She benefited from the same slave system that enabled Nathaniel's crimes. Her eventual resistance came only after she had witnessed unspeakable horrors and failed to prevent them, but she also preserved evidence that would otherwise have been destroyed. She risked her freedom and possibly her life to stop what she could stop. She used what limited power she possessed to save, at medievosist, least some children from trafficking, and she ensured that the truth would eventually be known, even if it took a century for that knowledge to emerge. The land where Sweetwater stood is now divided among several small farms in a section of Oconee National Forest. Hikers occasionally stumble across the old cemetery, though the markers are mostly illegible now, covered in lichen and cracked by a century and a half of weather. The stone foundation of the Typeses main house is still visible if you know where to look, slowly being consumed by kudzu and Virginia creeper. There is no historical marker noting what happened here, no memorial to the women who were violated, the children who were stolen, the lives destroyed by Nathaniel's experiments and Catherine's delayed intervention. The place itself has been forgotten by everyone except a handful of specialists who study the darkest corners of slavery's history, but the documents remain carefully preserved now in the University of Georgia's Special Collection Library. Researchers still come to study them, still grapple with what they reveal about the capacity for human cruelty and the complicity of those who witness evil but fail to stop it immediately. Students read excerpts in history classes, confronting the reality that the past was worse than they imagined, that the crimes of slavery extended far beyond what textbooks typically acknowledge. And Samuel's story, Pearl's story, Ruth's story, and Catherine's story continue to be told, imperfect and disturbing as they are, because forgetting would be worse than remembering. The truth, no matter how painful, serves as a warning about what happens when power is unchecked, when human beings are treated as property, when science is perverted to justify atrocity. This is the story of Sweetwater Plantation, not a ghost story or a tale of supernatural horror, but something far more terrifying. A true account of what human beings are capable of doing to one another when law and custom permit it, when economic incentives reward it, when pseudoscience rationalizes it. The real horror is not that such things happened in some distant, unimaginable past. The real horror is that they happened within the lifetimes of people whose grandchildren are still alive today. The real horror is how easy it is to forget, to minimize, to look away from evidence that makes us uncomfortable. What do you think of this story? Could Catherine have done more? Should we judge historical figures by the standards of their time or by universal moral principles? How do we reckon with the fact that many people benefited from systems they knew were wrong but felt powerless to change? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask. If this investigation into America's hidden history affected you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the past's darkest corners. Share this video with others who want to understand the truth about slavery beyond what textbooks teach. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and your perspectives add to our collective understanding of these difficult histories. These stories are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Only by confronting what really happened can we ensure it never happens again. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next investigation into the